Hey, Sean from Invest to Live. Today we're talking big, like billion dollar big. I want to understand and go to market around this idea of how do we build and grow billion dollar companies? How do we know what a billion dollar company looks like? How do we scale to that size? But even more than that, also from the investor or trader perspective, how do we research those markets? How do we identify where we should deploy our capital, where we should be looking for the future, and what that research looks like? Because it doesn't have to be really complicated. We're just trying to set some early seeds here to help you understand what that looks like and what that process could be to start to get your arms around it. Before jumping in, if you haven't subscribed, I'd really appreciate you doing so. And please hit the like button if you haven't. It really helps us get out in front of more people. So with that being said, let's talk big. We're not talking about opening up a restaurant down the street, which is still a great thing. We're not talking about identifying a local area to create some services in. We're thinking big, scalable. How do we solve a big problems? Now, not everyone can necessarily be successful here. Not all entrepreneurs have the background, the wherewithal, the ability to raise capital in this space. But we're not talking about necessarily that part of it. We're talking about how do we identify and think about it. This is all coming from my perspective as someone who has owned a business and sold it, how I successfully invest and create value for my capital that I put out in the markets. So whether you're an experienced entrepreneur or brand new to this and thinking about how I should position myself for success in a big way, or you're an investor and a trader and thinking about how do I find the next big thing? How do I get in early? How do I identify those markets? Those are some of the things we're thinking about today. What I would really welcome is any kind of feedback in the comments below. Do you do it a different way? Am I thinking about it in a way that you don't like? What should I be doing differently? Because I'm open to getting some new ideas as well. So without further ado, here's the way I really start off. I'm big into the idea of how I perform sort of my macro research against all of my ideas. I've never been big as a technical trader or investor. I like to think globally. I like to think about how things affect other things. I like to understand supply chains, raw materials, how they get to an end product, how that end product or service or offering gets out to the markets and grows, how we market them, how we bring it to the masses. And that's the key word is, how are we solving for the masses in big ways that either other people haven't or haven't done the right way or could be done in a more efficient way? That's the way I really think about it, both as an entrepreneur and as an investor. So let's start peeling the onion back a bit here. When I think about big change ideas, things that are going to create global perspective or a global way of changing life, I think for me right now, what I'm thinking about in the areas I'm most interested in, right off the bat, I'm interested in agricultural technology or agritech, as we often hear it nowadays. This is this idea of like, how do we look at the way food is being manufactured, delivered, created, grown exponentially for a growing population, right? That's sort of my first step on the journey is, from an agricultural perspective, do I understand how we're going to keep feeding so many new people every year after year after year, especially with challenges from the climate? Unpredictable weather patterns are constantly happening. Crops have to be grown in ways that are sustainable. The meat industry, be that beef, chicken, pork, whatever the case may be, how are they keeping up with it? As well as how are companies in the agritech space starting to think about how do we solve for that? So the Beyond Meats of the world, for example. This is a great place to start because I personally am really looking to space myself. I have no recommendations at this point, but I just like to start my basis off as far as like, how do I understand things like population growth? How do I understand what players are out there? Who's making big changes or impacts? What kind of technology is helping in this space? And then ultimately, how big is this market? Now, I'm gonna let you in on a little secret here. The market for eating is pretty darn big. So this is already like a great starting point for me in the way I think about my research. The next piece I wanna think about here is the fintech world. I believe personally that the financial space has and is continuing to be changed in many ways. I think that a lot of the things that we just sort of took for granted and allowed, we're not doing anything about. Like, I think it's crazy that if I want to transfer money, it takes several days to do so and costs me money. But the crypto space, you can transfer instantly, tie it to a blockchain and know that your money got where it's supposed to get. Like, that's just a micro example of what I'm talking about. But Bitcoin is a perfect example of that gigantic billion-dollar idea solving for a lot of problems. That said, you may not like Bitcoin, you may not understand Bitcoin. That's okay. We're not talking about necessarily putting our money there. Just saying that scale to go global quickly and easily is what we're looking for. Another area that I think is really huge, and I'm going to jump into some of this in a second here, is the energy space. Be this oil and gas, it could be solar, it could be new things that we're not thinking about, like algae creating power, could be hydrogen, could be anything really. And I think that this space is where we're trying to do a couple of different things at scale as well. Number one, how do we start to embrace the change in the energy markets, right? I understand that, solar and wind and, maybe wave-based or geothermal-based, not all this is necessarily immediately sustainable. I get that theoretically it is, but maybe not immediately. So the entrepreneur who comes out and can solve for this is solving a global problem. If you can find a new way of addressing energy concerns for Earth, I think you're going to find yourself in a really good spot. I think it's going to be a tough challenge, but for those who can identify those challenges, find unique and creative ways to solve for them, you're talking about not just probably billion-dollar ideas, but frankly, probably trillion-dollar ideas. And again, this goes back to the overall point here. How do we think about this? How do we approach it? How do we build our ideas around it? So I'm going to tell you my secret that hopefully isn't that much of a secret to anyone out there who's thinking about entrepreneurship or thinking about investing or thinking about just ways to get into these markets. I start in the most basic place possible, and that's Google. And I'm going to share that in just a second here. And I think that the reason I like to start here is I need to understand some broad things first and foremost. These are things that may not feel like a serious researcher should jump into this. It could be too simple. Shouldn't I be reading this or looking at that? Where I find my success most often comes is starting as low level as possible and building upon this idea upon idea upon idea until I find the sweet spot that I think has that potential, has that ability. And then even when I'm there, I want to understand who's trying to accomplish this or do it today. So rather than touch on every single point that I've talked about, from agriculture to fintech to energy, I'm going to just take agriculture as an example because I really do believe that there is going to be a massive need for companies to understand how to scale better, how to create new ways and sources of creating food. I think also there's a growing population. We don't know how that's going to be handled by the need to have more space to farm, more space for animals to graze, more creative ways to generate lab-grown meat, for example. Some of the cool things we're seeing today are like in vertical farms that are able to grow in massive amounts of food in really small, compact places. I also think that at a micro scale, we're seeing more small farms popping up. We're seeing more community farming happen. I think this is a great way for solving it on a micro level, but I still think the opportunity probably really exists for global-based, large-scale farming in efficient ways. This means efficient from a water perspective, efficient from an energy perspective, efficient from a delivery perspective, efficient from a survival perspective, in a sense that when you send that fruit, it doesn't rot on the way. Again, now what's going to really drive the billion-dollar, trillion-dollar idea out of this is not just the technology, not just the idea, but also doing it in a way that's going to be environmentally friendly. It's going to be energy friendly, but more than even all of those things, it's going to be the person or the company who can create the way to think about it in the safest possible way. There's lots of ways to make food more sustainable. It's just unfortunately not going to be really good for us. There's lots of ways to grow more food. It's just going to zap the resources from the way we do it. There's lots of ways to do X, Y, and Z, and there's many reasons we shouldn't. So this is how I think about those billion-dollar ideas as an entrepreneur and also as an investor. So let's start at a basic level. I'm going to start sharing my screen here, so bear with me for 1 second while I do that. And just slow right now, but here we are, simple Google searches, right? What I want to start to understand is, are people thinking about these things? What kind of growth are we seeing? How do I find these companies? How do I start doing my research? So first and foremost, here's what I want to understand. What's today's global population? It helps when I type well, which I don't. So I just want to start off with some basic numbers here. Today's world population is about 7.9 billion with a B. So right off the bat, we've got a big case of things we're trying to solve for. So I'm going to write that down just so I want to reference that in the future as we go through this. So currently 7.9 people in 2021. Global population. But I also want to understand, what's that growth rate? So we see about 1.1% per year. So at 1.1% per year on 7.9, we should be hitting 8 billion pretty soon. And 1% is a huge number when we're talking about huge numbers, right? I talked about this in another video that If you could grow your savings or investing by 1%, the long-term results are massive and they really compound. When we think about that from the standpoint of population, it almost really, for me, has this effect of saying like, wow, how are we going to consistently and meaningfully increase the food supply, the safe, efficient food supply by over 1% per year to match a 1% growth in population, while at the same time understanding we don't have an increase in clean water, we don't have an increase in energy supplies, we don't have an increase in land to grow. So this is where this idea for innovation, I start to really think through it. I start to think about the challenges. So within about 30 seconds of Google searching for my $1 billion idea, I understand a few things. The population of the world is big and it is growing. And we have challenges that are tied to transportation of food, healthy growth of food, where to grow it, how to do it with less. So already I'm starting to think through like, okay, we've got resource challenges. Can we do it more efficiently? How do I do it in a way that takes up less space? Could I grow it faster? Could I start to leverage different materials like what a Beyond Meat is doing with lab grown? So the next thing I want to understand is, who's doing it today? So let's just do something simple, like what's happening in agritech. Okay, so we can see there's some good newsletters out there. There's some materials. I can start to read more about what is agritech. I can also see, there's actually a pretty big summit that just happened this past month from the World Agritech USA Conference, or Summit rather. Again, this is a good sign to me that this is a space that exists. We're starting to see some growth around it. But let's actually jump into that as well, right? Let's call it agritech, growth. And this is really how I do my research. Seriously, like I start with Google before I do anything because I need to understand at scale, what's the market I'm working with? Why am I deciding to work with this market? What kind of growth rate are we seeing? So we can see, obviously, the more we can tie technology into food, the more we're going to be able to see that growth and the more transparency we're going to see in it. So let's just see what we have for our first pop-up here. Not the easy numbers that I was hoping to find, right? And this is how you know I'm doing this live and not just doing lots of edits. But let's just see here. Let's see how we're growing from gmiresearch.com. Hopefully this loads and isn't terrible. So lots of material in here. I'm not going to run the report on it, but one thing I can see here is we're obviously growing. There's a lot of interest in it. We're pulling up some interesting facts here. I'm not going to break down an entire report. So let me do something different here. I also want to understand how many other people are looking at agritech in general. So I'm going to jump over to Google Trends as well. Let's do this. And for those folks out there who do a lot of social media work or social arb from an investing perspective or research perspective, this is often a great place to start as well. And I just want to understand a few key things. Like right now, sitting here in March in 2021, what are we seeing from a search perspective around agritech? Well, we can see that, early in 2020, it was peaking several times, right? We can see it coming up to that 100 mark. This is about the highest rate search we can see, right? We can also see that it kind of went up, went down, went up, went down. Somewhere around July 2020, obviously really in the midst of the pandemic, this really wasn't top of mind for a lot of people. It's got some spikes, but then it drops down again. And this just tells me that like there's interest and then it goes away, it dissipates, it comes back again, it goes away. But how does agritech compare to a search term like, let's see, agriculture technology? And we start to get a bit of a better feel. Now, most people may not have heard of the term agritech or not familiar with what it is. If we actually think about purely agricultural technology, I get a little bit better information, a little bit better feel for what's out there and the kind of interest around it. So I can see that although for some points here, it stayed relatively close, it is generally higher, it's peaking a lot more, and the search trends tend to be going up over time. So this is another example of like, okay, I can see people are searching for things. Agriculture and agritech in general definitely have some search results. They're hitting some pretty good peaks around different areas of the world. They're hitting some good peaks around different areas of how I'm searching for it. So instead of the last 12 months, let's look at the past 30 days. And also, let's not just look at the United States, let's look worldwide. So that's what we're trying to solve for. So funny enough, when we look worldwide, right, agritech is actually trending a lot better. And agricultural technology, although still fine, is not quite doing as well. And this is the funny kind of things I like to think about when I research, like, How does the way people search for things and the way they look at it from a global perspective, a near-term perspective, how does that impact my ability to understand what's happening in that space? So I just want to share this Google Trends piece because I think it's really interesting to look at how we use it. I'm going to go back to Google for a second here and understand agritech companies. Who's out there doing it today? And we can see a couple of different things here. Like, let's look at the top agritech companies that are revolutionizing farming today. And again, this is just my basic level research. How I start to think about it because this is an area that I think can have a large impact. I'm not necessarily going to say that I know any of these or that I do anything with them. I'm certainly not recommending that you invest in anything here until you do your own research. But we can see there's some focus here doing different things. Looks like India, China, another India, right? So there's definitely some people out there doing some cool things, trying to invest, trying to build, trying to solve for this problem. So what I'm going to do as an investor or as an entrepreneur is start to understand, well, what are they trying to solve for? How can I do it better? Is there a way that I can jump in here and change their perspective? So at this point, what I'm going to do is take a pause because I don't want to go super deep on it and just say, like, this is the way that I think about generating big ideas. The way that I might do it from an entrepreneurial perspective might try to tie in some skills that I have, some skills that I have with the people around me, what ideas I think I can raise capital for. But as an investor, as a trader, it's a little bit different approach. I'm looking for companies that are well capitalized, but also focusing on big, strong, hard problems. And those are going to be where I want to start to key in on, understand the revenue models, understand how they go to market, what does solving for it actually do. And then the final piece that I want to show today, just from a standpoint of really baseline, is in agriculture, technology, revenue. Let's just see if we got anything out there. So global agriculture technology as service market looks like it's getting into the billions. Not huge, only about 2.4 billion by 2024. But the reason why I think this is significant to call out here, just at least in this one piece, is like any market that hasn't really come to fruition yet or hasn't really solved anything in a big way, I think that there is someone who can do this big, someone who can make a major change, someone who can invest in the future and make something happen. The key with a lot of these research issues for me is it's always going to be focused on, as you can see here, like, hey, it might hit 2.5 billion. But this is really just understanding the technology as a service piece of it. This is how we're helping farms, people who are doing the building, the manufacturing of the food, the shipping perhaps, how they're leveraging technology. So if we're just seeing 2.5 billion there, the overall market is probably much bigger. The question is, like, how do I get a piece of that realistically, and how do I scale it at scale? Scale it at scale. That's an interesting one. But I want to look at this, right? Agriculture revenue in general. Now we're talking, right? So when we get away from just trying to understand purely from the tech perspective, we can see that the overall market for agriculture, and this of course is expected because it goes out to the populations in general, that what we're looking at here is over $1 trillion GDP just in 2019 in the US. So think about that globally and think about that scaled out across not just GDP, but in general, what that kind of revenue looks like. You don't have to win big in this space to have a huge impact or a huge return. So the more of this baseline understanding you can do, the size of the market, the size of the growth, the way the population is looking, are people actually searching and trying to solve for these problems? These are all sort of the baseline ways that I build into this idea of how I bring to market my own research, how and where I looked for the companies I want to invest in, who has experience or is currently doing things here right now. So I encourage you to think about how you would do this differently, how you potentially would think about what works for you, how you might do it in different ways or scale differently than I am. I also think that there's an opportunity, certainly from the investor side of the house here, to think about who are the top 10, the top 15, the top 20 companies doing this. It could be huge Fortune 500 companies that have this as a piece of their business. There's a lot of agricultural companies that come in and help with things from the chemical space, the way we look at resources, the way we have seeds, lots of controversy around some of those companies too, I will say, but just for the record, let's put that aside for this conversation. And I also think there's a lot of folks on the tech side who are trying to optimize and create efficiency around it. Whether that's, like we said, the Beyond Meats of the world, the vertical farmers of the world, the people who are looking at agriculture as a real estate investment, right? How we're getting dividends from our land and growing on it. I still think personally that there's going to be someone out there, there's going to be a company who comes out who's going to really be the next AWS of agriculture, the next Apple of agriculture, the next Ford of agriculture, right? They're going to find a way to do things at scale that's going to create just huge efficiencies across the market, the way they leverage energy, the way they leverage shipping, the way they leverage sustainability. I think that's going to be the key, is when we can tie, excuse me, energy, sustainability, and growth together, focus on a global and massive scale like agriculture and the food space in general. I think that's where we're going to have billion-dollar ideas burst into trillion-dollar ideas. I think my challenge is, are you the right person? I will tell you that as someone who is an angel investor and does put my money where my mouth is, I'm constantly trying to understand what's coming down the pipe. Where should I be focused? Where can we solve for today, but scale for tomorrow? And then really, really grow big beyond that. So if you're doing something interesting in the space, drop it below. Tell us what you're building, what you're working on. If you think there's a different way you want me to show you how I research this beyond just my first initial steps, I'm happy to do so. I just don't want to drop a 2-hour video on everybody. So again, I want to sum it up. When we think about billions of dollars and going big and solving big, it also helps to understand the baseline underlying metrics, right? I was talking about the Suez Canal being shut down the other day, and how that supply chain interruption doesn't just mean you're getting your order a couple days late. It could mean that materials are late to build. It could mean that it stops the shippers from getting their materials out of the warehouses. Now all the boats are sitting in the ocean losing, I heard the latest number was 9.6 billion a day. So when you start to look at that giant supply chain, right, that 9.6 billion per day, that's how I think about, like, wow, that's a big, big problem, because we only have the Suez Canal in that region, right? Just like the Panama Canal in between the Americas. Like, if that shuts down or has a major problem, that's a massive global hit. When you're solving for those global big problems, that's how you create these gigantic ideas that scale big time. But even more so, when you can scale and solve these problems in ways that also address other big markets, it gets even better, right? Like, Bitcoin's a huge idea, but the big detractor oftentimes is energy. Well, what if we can mine Bitcoin in a more energy efficient way? That solves for a big problem. What if we could create food and create agriculture and grow in more environmentally friendly ways or more sustainable ways? Like, when we can start to stack and double down on these big ideas, that's where it gets huge, right? Like, I think to myself all the time, this is actually a great habit to get into in general when you're thinking about big ideas, billion-dollar ideas, trillion-dollar ideas even, is like, how observant are you in your day-to-day environment? When you're driving down the street or walking down the street or taking a train or a bus or anything else you're doing, are you paying attention to things like, how many trees are being torn down to build a new property? Are these properties getting solar panels on their roofs? I live on the East Coast, so I can see the gigantic wind farms from time to time, depending on where I am. But I always think to myself, like, it can't be that efficient, or because there's so few of them. But at the same time, we also hear, like, there's some aesthetic issues there. There's some energy efficiency. There's some, how do we transfer energy in a good way, right? I think about, like, Tesla coming out with roof panels and then a battery on a wall. Like, hey, that's a great idea. Who else can do this and do it in a more efficient way, or scale it in a way that's it's more sort of sustainable? I think about, from the builder's perspective, how are they getting the wood to build? How are they getting the raw materials and the labor? What does that labor cost? What does the wood cost? Is the wood really sustainable in the way that we're manufacturing it? Then I think, like, well, if I was going to buy a brand new home, are they going to have, efficient builds? Is it a sustainable build in general? Will there be solar panels on it already? Does solar even make sense depending on where I live? Like, always try to drill down as deep as you can and understand the impact on other areas. Because I think the folks who are able to do these things in the future in really efficient, really scalable ways, really in ways where they're impacting both my emotions, my wallet, my well-being, those are where the big ideas lay. So I probably rambled on a little bit at the end there, but this just happens to be a topic I'm really passionate about and really care about. And I think the beauty of all of this is the data is already there. So the more we can understand the data, how the data interacts with itself in different ways, how we can apply different metrics and pieces to it, and the way we can look at it from a very big perspective, the more likely you're going to be able to find and raise capital for your next big idea, for the next big company you're growing. From that capital perspective as an investor, whether that's on private markets or public markets or a trader, the more you can understand the interoperability between these different kind of big ideas, the way they tie together, and the way those ideas can sort of go out at scale, the more return you're going to see in your capital in better and newer ways. Not to mention, it's just great from a diversification perspective as well. So look, with that, I rambled on a little bit at the end, but only because I really love this stuff. And when I think about, if I was going to go out today, deploy my capital to start my own company, I'm definitely looking in agricultural technology. I'm looking at fintech. I'm looking at energy and energy technology. I'm looking at sustainability. I'm looking at the things that aren't yet mandatory, but I believe will be at some point. there will be a point where companies have to be forced to keep their carbon rates down. We're going to be at a point where we don't have a choice but to farm in a new way. We're going to be at a point at some point, and maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not in 100 years, I don't know. But at some point, we're not going to be able to keep drilling fossil fuels. We're going to have a better and more efficient way to do it. And a couple of solar panels sitting on a roof is probably not going to cut it. And a couple of turbines sitting out a mile offshore is probably not going to cut it. So, who's going to be the person to solve for it? How are they going to solve for it at scale? And how are we going to deliver it to the market in a way that generates profit for investors? And I think that you're probably the right person watching this right now to potentially do it and reap the rewards for yourself. So with all that said, a lot of excitement and actually just really feeling good about this. I would love to hear about what you're doing, what you're bringing to market, how you think about these problems, and leave a comment below to let us know how. So really appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and hopefully made it to the end. Thanks so much. Have a good weekend.